hit the obligatory few seconds to make sure that we are recording. Yes. Okay, Dark Bleatings, everyone. I am really, really excited. We have Eric LaRocca with us today, who is a Bram Stoker Award nominated and a Splatterpunk Award winning author. I'm sure that everyone here is going to be familiar with your work already, Eric. The thing I want to most talk to Eric about and enthuse about, is your upcoming book, At Dark I Become Loathsome. Would you like to tell people a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Kaylee. I really appreciate it. It's so awesome to be able to talk to you about this book. Yeah, so At Dark I Become Loathsome is essentially about a grieving man who undergoes like a traumatic, a lot of trauma, a lot of loss in a short period of time. And the book is basically an exploration of him trying to process this grief as well as trying to help others in this ritual that he's sort of designed to kind of give people who have suicidal ideation like a second chance at life, like a rebirth. And it's all about his construction of this ritual and how the ritual begins to take a much darker turn, and he eventually suffers like a psychotic break. And it's all about his mental decay, his downfall, him spiraling, fun stuff like that. So it's a very dark book. Deals a lot with heavy trigger warnings. So there are trigger warnings listed like on Goodreads and Storygraph. So if folks are a little cautious about approaching material with this kind of intense subject matter, I definitely recommend looking at the trigger warnings before you proceed. But it's a very special book to me. I loved writing it, and I'm really excited that it's going to be out in the world very soon on January 28th.
Yeah, I'm so excited for it to be unleashed so that everyone else could read it. It's really compelling. The story, the character work was amazing.
Thank you.
The Something that I'm kind of like known for in my reviews is, generally speaking, I cannot stand it when people take a mental health angle at all, because more often than not, I find that it's sort of a lazy shortcut to doing horror. But I found it was so, I didn't even actually think about it as an aspect as I was reading the book, because it's so sincerely and empathetically handled. And I think it's really hard to depict grief and loss.
Yeah.
I think most of us have felt it, but there's only a couple of writers that I've ever read that really like grasp how to convey it, and I thought that you did such a wonderful job.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. I'm very interested in grief in general, and I'm somebody that, I mean, fantasizes probably isn't the right word, but I definitely imagine what it's going to be like when I lose special people in my life, like my parents or my partner. And I also have suffered a lot of loss, like at a young age, with people that I really cared about. But when I approach fiction, I said this in another interview recently, like I kind of approach my stories almost like I'm a chronicler of human suffering and depravity. Like I'm one step removed from it. So like I'm describing these horrible things happening to people and this horrible suffering, but I'm trying to not insert myself too much in it. But I'm also trying to like handle these things with a level of sensitivity that maybe people will appreciate. So I definitely really value your feedback and that you thought it was like handled really well. That means a lot to me.
Something I thought about as I was reading it was something Adam Neville said to me about his approach. He was trying to capture like the female experience in one of his books, uh, about kind of specific fears of men and things like that. And I said it felt, I couldn't believe that a man had written that, just from like my own perspective. And he said he was trying really hard to not sort of like sensationalize or glamorize
Yeah.
those elements, which is something I think that you did here as well, because talking about really heavy things, but it's not in a spectacle.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, right? Like it shouldn't
Yeah.
be that. I mean, I guess, every writer is going to approach their work differently, and however they approach it, that's what's best for them. But there is no like showmanship to grief, really, and like spectacle to like suffering. It's you have to approach this with a level of tenderness, I feel like, in a lot of ways. And I feel like this book, at least I hope it does, I hope it resonates with people, and I hope it provides people like an outlet, like people who feel like disenfranchised and alienated and like an outcast. Like I really wanted this book to be like a love letter to those who feel very different or monstrous, you know?
Yeah, I felt even when he our main character starts to make more questionable decisions,
Yeah,
I felt that I couldn't find it in me to hate him or anything. I just wanted to give him a hug,
yeah.
tell him it would be okay. It was just I couldn't put it down. I read it in 2 sittings and I only put it down the first time because I had to leave the house somewhere. Um, so I don't want to give any spoilers for the book at all, but I have to ask you about the ritual that he comes up with. It does involve burying people
Yes.
alive, and I thought that's such a unique premise. I've never read anything like that before, especially as a means to um, trying to help people through what they're going through so that they'll sort of come out feeling better afterwards. What inspired you with that? Because the imagery was amazing especially for a horror novel.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. To be truthful, a lot of the ritual were like they were composites of things that I had read online about different cultures and how they approach death and how they approach loss and grief and suffering. There was an article I read a couple years ago. I mean, I've had this idea for quite some time. Like, I think since before, like I think since before 2020, I've had this idea. So I've been like sitting on it for a while. But I read this article about this death, this like makeshift fake death ritual that took place in Asia, about people who would go to this service and have them go through like these rituals to like come to terms with their losses, come to terms with their grief and suffering. And one of the practices that they did was a live burial of these people. And I thought that was really fascinating. And it made me think, like, what kind of person would agree to something like this? Like, what kind of person would organize something as really, strange and bewildering as this kind of ritual? And it seemed like the perfect entry point to this story, because I knew I really wanted to write a character study about human suffering and loss and grief. And I thought that this kind of arcane ritual that had taken place in Asia for like many, many years, I thought it was like the perfect sort of doorway into this narrative. Um, and I forget what article. I think it was like on Vice or Vulture or something. But it was a really interesting piece on people who have suicidal ideation and want to experience like a rebirth and coming to terms with their losses, and how that the live burial sort of like is that rebirth for them. It's that, explosion of emotion and their fears and their frustrations and all of that. So to me, it was a really great thing to discover, and it felt like really organic to this story in general. And I also knew that I wanted the piece to be sort of a pseudo like revenge tale almost. With I don't want to spoil anything for the listeners, but I wanted there to be like an element where the the elements from Ashley's past come to the forefront with this ritual and what he's devised for people. And that was kind of the way in which like the story came together for me. And initially, I was studying screenwriting at a college here in Boston, and I was contemplating doing this concept for a screenplay for one of my classes. And I think one of my teachers, I think they said, "Oh, it's like a little too grim, so maybe like think of something a little bit more marketable." So I ended up shelving it for a while, and then when Norman Reedus and Blackstone reached out to me, I had this idea kind of in my portfolio, just sort of floating around, and I thought, well, this would be a really interesting project, especially for Norman Reedus, because he's kind of known for playing really strange, unnerving parts. He has that sort of like aura around him where he's just like perfect for the horror genre, but really also I feel like plays the outcast really well too. So he has optioned the book for a film, but I don't know if like he would be attached to like star in it or anything. I just know like his production company has optioned the rights to the book, but it just seemed like the perfect project for him when he first approached me, and I was like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, at first it was a little surprising to get like an email from Norman Reedus's agent just like have him say like, oh yeah, he's a fan of your work, and I'm like, yeah, right, okay, sure. But
Yes.
yeah, it's like it was true. It worked out like beautifully, and I'm just like really excited for this book to come out. In the US with Blackstone / Norman Reedus's Big Bald Head imprint, and then in the UK, Titan Books is putting it out. So it's exciting.
I have to tell you, Eric, this is for anyone watching or listening. This is the first time that Eric and I have ever spoken. Um, so this might sound a bit weird, but I've been watching your career over the last few years. I've just been seeing more and more buzz about your books, and I follow Norman Reedus's production company, so I actually saw his involvement with you there first, and I was so excited for you when I saw that, because I was like, this is kind of like plays into kind of like the dream for any author to have recognition from other people in the creative arts that are doing really well. And it's nice to know that people that you like are reading your work and enjoying it so much to the point where they want to work with you. So
Yeah, I mean, that's what's surprising is like someone on his level of like stardom, because he is a star. Like he's a major celebrity. The fact that he like knew about my work was insane to me. And I still haven't like officially met him yet. Like we've worked on this book for a couple years now, but I still haven't actually met him. But um, I I just can't thank him enough for everything he's done and really like championed me. And Blackstone in general, as well as Titan in the UK, they've done so much to promote my work and grow my brand and my audience, and it's just been so wonderful. So I'm really glad that you recognize that too, that you saw like that announcement and you were like, oh my god, hell yes, that's amazing, that's so cool.
I was sat here like I was just so excited for you. I actually met Norman Reedus once, but like really quickly for a photo op at a Walking Dead convention.
Oh,
And my
cool.
tip to you is just don't lose it and scream "I love you" as you run towards him.
I was gonna do that, but now that you told me not to, I think maybe I won't.
Very kind. And I'm
Yeah.
sure it's not the first or last time it happened that day, but you're right, he is a star. You can't really get anywhere neat. Like, he's really nice. Like, he'd like walk around the convention center a few times, but obviously with people shielding him because they're
Yeah.
concerned for his safety. But yeah, he was yeah, very, very nice. That was I'm a huge Walking Dead and Norman Reedus fan, so this collaboration to me is like I've got my fingers crossed that everything pans out like everybody hopes, and
I
I'd
hope it
love to
works
see them.
out. Yeah, I mean, you never know with film stuff. I mean, I've had a couple things like in sort of development for a little while, and you never know where these things end up, and you don't know like if people are actually reading the scripts, or if they're like, you don't know like when it's going to happen. It's not real until like it's up on the screen.
Yeah.
That's the way I view it. So for me, I'm kind of like a step removed from the whole process, but it would be wonderful, I mean, to see any of my books translated to film. I mean, I grew up watching so many amazing films, and I'm definitely like a student of film, especially like the horror film, and it would just be really, really special. So
I think your work is really, you have a very unique voice, and the types of stories that you're writing are different. I think the closest comparison, and you probably already heard this, I was reminded a little bit of Exquisite Corpse as I was reading this
yeah,
book.
yeah,
Although the stories are wildly different, but I think it was the way I think that the way I described that book was heinous, but I loved it,
yeah.
because it's horrible, but
It's one of my favorite books of all time, that book.
it's amazing. But it's there are a few people that I've like said, oh no, this isn't for you. Like, it's
Yeah,
not. It's because it's a really really hard read, but it's so beautifully written and um well told. And that's the kind of vibe I get with your stories as well, is that you deal with really dark things, but the way that you deal with it, I don't know, there's just, I really connect to your writing. I just feel I relate. I don't know what it says about me that I relate to your characters so much.
I
But
love that. I love that. I hope that they are somewhat relatable to people when I write them. I mean, obviously I'm writing about like kind of the worst things happening to people, and certain characters doing like the worst things imaginable to other characters. But I do hope that there is like a level of like identification in some of these stories. Like, a lot of us are monstrous and feral and unhinged, and like there's nothing really wrong with that. Like, we are flawed. We're inherently flawed as people.
yeah, the thing that I was picking up on a lot with our main character is that he feels loathsome. He feels like, there was a lot of self-hatred in his sort of
Yes.
inner monologue, and he didn't deserve to feel that way. um you know Especially initially. He's just a guy dealing with stuff, and
Yeah,
he's got things he's struggling with since before the passing of his loved one and everything. So I
sure.
was and I sort of half related to that aspect of it as well. So you know if you grow up in certain areas, or there are certain things about you that other you as far as society is concerned, it you can internalize it, can't you? And it makes you feel like there's something wrong with you, when actually there's nothing wrong with you. Just
Right,
you
right. And
but you
that's exactly how I felt growing up, like as a queer kid in Connecticut, like rural Connecticut. It was kind of like my own private hell. Like, I had a great family. I had a great loving mom and dad and super supportive family, but everyone else knew I was different, and everyone else treated me differently because they knew I was a queer person, and they didn't really know how to like handle me, I guess. They didn't know how to react to me, and I think we're inherently afraid of things we don't understand or can't really comprehend. So it makes sense why they reacted that way, but um, it's hurtful. It's harmful for a child to feel that way and to feel so alienated and ostracized from their peers. I look back on certain moments from my childhood, and I really do kind of feel bad for like my former self, because it was rough. Like, it was pretty rough, but I'm glad I made it out, and I'm glad I had like a lot of great role models, and I'm glad I had a lot of good books to read and great films to watch. And like, you mentioned Exquisite Corpse. Exquisite Corpse was definitely one of those books that was like a turning point for me. That was like, wow, you can write this kind of material and people will respond to it. Like, people will buy it and people will engage with it meaningfully, hopefully. And that was a huge turning point. And then, you know, reading Clive Barker was another amazing turning point for me. I read Clive first, actually, and then got turned on to Poppy Z. Bright, and then Kathy Koja, and then all of like the Splatterpunk authors. But yeah, just like, you know, going back to your statement of just about like feeling different, like I feel like a lot of splatterpunk and horror in general is a safe space for us, because we do feel different and we do feel like we're on the outside of everything else. And I really want this book to be, I want this to be like a call to others who feel similarly afflicted.
Oh yeah, it's even if you're not exactly the same type of person as this character, there's so much that he's feeling is so relatable. I'm fine saying this, so no one listening needs to worry or anything, but I have some experience with PTSD because I had a really like surprising car accident this time, and it made me feel very insane because, you know, like you're sort of operating on a very high stress level when you go through something like that, and my anxiety about everything was through the roof. And initially I was like, oh well, this is understandable, I've had a shock. And then over time, I noticed that everyone was a little bit treading on eggshells around me all the time, and I didn't know if it was because I was actually being set off and making things difficult for people, or if because people didn't know how to react to me because I'd gone through this thing and I don't know, more anxious than usual or whatever. But it just, that's what I always relate to. And also I was a kid that got picked on in school, so
Same.
Yeah, so that feeling of everybody just wants to be sort of accepted, or at the very least not looked at weirdly.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to feel like a pariah, but yeah, I felt, I don't know, I just wanted to give him a hug. I felt so sorry for him, and I just wanted to say, well, there's nothing, you know, you're okay, there's nothing,
Right.
you know, you're not loathsome, you're fine, you're just a normal person going through a thing.
Right. Yeah. And that's like what my editor and I worked on a lot when we were like crafting what eventually became the final version of this book. So just to give you like a little bit of background, like at Blackstone, the way it works is they kind of like hire out freelance editors to work with you on your project. So you're working with an editor in-house, but you're also working with like an outside freelance editor on the book. And I got paired with Melissa Ann Singer, who is a phenomenal, phenomenal editor. She was the senior editor at Tor for many, many years, and she worked with like Daniel Kraus. She worked with Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho. So she's legit. She's amazing. And she made this book so, so much better. But one of the things that we were really conscious of while we were writing it was we do want people to feel like invested in Ashley's story. And we maybe like we don't expect them to maybe identify with a lot of the choices that he makes throughout the narrative, but we want them to be at least interested in what he's doing and why he's doing that. So that's something that like at the craft level, I really had to kind of develop more nuance to the story, because the first draft was very much a first draft and didn't have some of the elements in the book that make it what it is now. And then there were elements that we actually did have to cut because they were like a little too graphic, and they were, some of the people at Blackstone were just afraid of pushing the envelope maybe a little too far and going past the point of no return, because once you have a character do a certain thing, it kind of becomes like there are certain things that are just like unforgivable that a character can do, that you can't really see like the motivation for what they're doing anymore, and it becomes kind of just like them going through grotesquerie after grotesquerie. So we did have to like modify some of the things toward the end of the book, and especially some of the graphic depictions. I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, it was definitely a great experience to edit this book, and Melissa like really brought her A game and really made everything so much better. Like if this book is a good book, it's because of her, honestly.
Oh, you should give yourself some credit as well, though, Eric.
Well, she really like helped me refine a lot of what I was struggling to articulate like in the first draft, and really helped me like slow down and really think about like character motivation and arcs, certain like character arcs, and just yeah, just made it so much more powerful, I think. At least I hope so. I hope people resonate. I hope it resonates with people. The thing that I worry about is when people leave my books and feel sort of apathetic or indifferent. I love art that is like provocative and challenging. So when people encounter my work, I really want them to have like an intense reaction. So either they absolutely love it or they absolutely despise it. Like I really that's what I really hope for more than anything. And I try not to think too much about audience reactions while I'm writing my pieces. Uh, but at the end of the day, I do really want like a reaction from people.
Yeah, I always say I'd rather have a scathing, hateful review if someone really hated my book rather than no review at all. Because at
Yeah.
least there's been uh some feeling has happened. I think in terms of extreme horror, so funny because I associate extreme horror with particular topics, I guess, and
Mhm.
I'm not saying there are like levels, as in there's like a higher art form of it than others, but there are definitely different categories, I think, of extreme horror. So um your work and Poppy Z Bright I'd put in one category, and then the kind of stuff where you're putting uh babies in microwaves and stuff,
Yeah.
like they're just different things. And I think maybe if someone who's really into like the really hardcore, like way all the violence, like maybe that's the kind of person who isn't for your work because you're quite
Yeah.
deep emotional with yours.
Yeah, there definitely is like a kind of like tier system, not necessarily in regard to like quality. I'm
Mhm.
not talking about like quality. I'm just talking about like level of violence and
Yeah.
level of like intensity. And there are some works that are like even maybe a little too much for me, that are just like really like nasty, vicious. Um, I'm trying to think like there's a really great book that I love, called Survivor by J.F. Gonzalez, and
Mhm.
it's a phenomenal book, but it's very intense. I don't know if you've read it, but
Yeah, I know Gonzalez's work.
yeah. So I mean that, but there's like there's a level of sophistication to his writing too. So I can't necessarily say like it's on a different tier. But I will say that like the kind of extreme horror that I write, and I don't even know if I'm going to continue writing this level of like extreme visceral horror my entire career, because I do have some other books scheduled to come out over the next couple years that are more like quiet and reflective and like less, they still have the elements of body horror that I love, but they're not as like in your face, confrontational, aggressive the way like this book is, the way like How Dark I Become Loathsome is. But yeah, just I'm just forever inspired by, Poppy Z Bright, and Kathy Koja is another one. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but like
Oh.
she wrote The Cipher, which is a really excellent book. She also wrote Skin, which is all about like performance art and like metal and people reshaping their bodies with like, just crazy, crazy stuff. And that book is actually coming out again through Meerkat Press, and I was able to write the intro for it. And that was just like such an honor because I remember reading that book in college and just being like, once again blown away and feeling so seen and so valued and appreciated, because you really don't see, at least when I was growing up and when I was looking for like queer transgressive fiction, like I wasn't finding a lot of it, but maybe I wasn't looking in the right places. But because then later I discovered Dennis Cooper, who wrote like Frisk and Closer and Try and like all of his amazing work, The Sluts. Just amazing, amazing stuff. So maybe I wasn't looking in the right places, but I mean, you do have to admit some of these gems are kind of well hidden too.
Yeah,
It's
it's
a
not like
struggle.
mainstream, so it's
Yeah, yeah, it can be hard, and it's really surprising to me at least that a publisher as big as Blackstone and as big as Titan they're putting so much goodwill and effort behind this book when it is so like not easily digestible. You know what I mean?
yeah, it's very raw and yeah, well, I think the indie presses have got a lot to do with the expansion of this kind of work because you would never have seen any kind of extreme horror, say 15 years ago. It would just sort of, well, you'd see it, but well, for example, Exquisite Corpse, that was a shock to my system because I didn't even know about extreme horror, and I picked that up at random based on the title because I was looking for zombie books.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Imagine. But it was it changed my life. I thought,
Yeah.
wow, you didn't that was the first book like that I'd ever read, and I was like, I didn't even realize that horror like that existed.
Totally.
That set me off. But I was looking for it then, and it was hard to find. It's
Yeah.
in the
And
last
like,
few years.
that's kind of the thrill with some of this stuff. Like it's almost like looking for like the video nasties from like the 1980s that were banned in Britain. Like it's searching for like the forbidden and searching for like the off limits. Like that's so cool. You know what I mean? Like when you are like on the hunt and you're looking for these like little gems and then you find something. Like I can't tell you how validating it was to find like Dennis Cooper at an early age and just like read his material. And then recently, I mean, I read a book that completely blew me away, and it was like it's one of her lesser known books, but it felt like discovering a gem. It was called Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates.
Yeah.
That book completely stunned me. I was like, holy shit, like this is amazing. And it's so visceral and graphic, and you're really like in the mind of the main character. And there are all these like little drawings throughout the book, like little sketches that are just like so bewildering and like off-putting. And it's just a remarkable book, but you really have to like look for it. But I think almost I would almost prefer a book like one of my books be a little more hard to find and less visible because it's more meaningful to the person who needs it when they eventually find it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So as someone who writes this kind of stuff and obviously is a fan of it, what do you think of there's already quite a lot of snobbery about horror just in general, and it's even worse with extreme horror where people tend to, I don't know, they're like, oh, there's literature and then there's horror, and
Yeah,
that's
it's so
down in,
true. It's so true.
yeah. And I think I'm drawn to horror because I find that it's the most honest genre when it comes to people.
Yeah, that's what Haley Piper says. I don't know if you're familiar with Haley's work, but Haley Piper has said multiple times that horror is the most honest genre, and it's so true because horror makes you look unflinchingly at the brutality and the grotesquerie and the awfulness, and it really makes you question yourself and question others and think to yourself maybe like we are all here to suffer. We all are capable of doing harm to our fellow man. Horror is extremely honest, but it's also extremely cathartic. So a lot of these people that have this like literary snobbishness, like it's unfounded. It makes no sense to me because I've read horror that is intensely visceral, but also extremely sophisticated.
Mhm.
And there are so many books that you could classify as horror, but maybe don't get marketed as horror for fear of that like snobbishness that you were just talking about. I just had the book on the tip of my tongue. The Vegetarian by Han Kang. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
Mm-mm.
it's an exceptional book. It's translated from the original Korean in which it was written, and it's all about this woman's life that kind of spirals out of control after she just decides to become a vegetarian one day after having this like dream about, I need to become a vegetarian. And it's so intense and uncomfortable. Uh, I finished reading this other book a couple days ago that left me completely breathless. And it's like, it's billed as a literary book, but it's horror. It's a horror novel. It's called The Discomfort of Evening. I forget who wrote it exactly, but it won the Booker Prize in 2020. And it's exceptional. It's all about loss and loss of faith, how religion kind of like mutilates us from the inside out if we depend on it too much. It's all set on this very rural farm in the Netherlands and about this family that sort of implodes after the death of their son. And the young girl, his sister, is kind of left to herself and figuring out like her own grief, and the things that some of these characters do throughout the novel are just absolutely like loathsome and disgusting. And it's such a horrifying book, but it's not billed as horror, and I don't understand why. But then when I think of what you just said, like how there is that snobby attitude toward horror fiction, it's like, yeah, that they probably didn't want to market it as horror, and they just kind of market it as like upscale, like literary fiction. But there's so much to be said about horror in general and how cathartic and how wonderful it can be. And it's a genre for the outcasts, I've always thought, you know.
Yeah, I always find, especially with cinema, if a horror film will come out, and then if it starts to do really well in the mainstream public, all of a sudden it's a thriller or it's a sci-fi action. Or I always think Misery is the first example I think of with that. Like, that is a horror story about a guy stuck in a bed with someone who's not very well.
Yeah, totally.
Looking after him. And I think about Alien as well. That is undeniably horror. But I say that, but people have argued with me about it.
It's like a haunted house in space. That's how I've always viewed it. It's like gothic horror in space.
Yeah, and Aliens as well. I used to weed out potential dates when they'd go, oh, what? I'd say, oh, I like horror. And they go, what's your favorite horror film? And then I'd say, oh, Alien or Aliens. And then if they said, well, actually, that's a sci-fi, I'd go, right, no.
Yeah, you're gone. Goodbye.
I'm not gonna justify this and get pedantic about it. But yeah, it's I think that splatterpunk and extreme horror suffers even more for people just turning their noses up and assuming, because there is, like with all genres, there is some trash, but generally speaking, there is an art to it. I find a lot of the really crazy extreme horror is very funny because it's pushed to absurd levels sometimes. Totally. But I think that that's the point, isn't it? To make you, just to sort of desensitize you and make you laugh.
Yeah, I mean, there's a point to every extreme horror book that I've encountered. I mean, a book like Cows by Matthew Stocko, I forget how you pronounce his last name, but I mean, that book is delightfully absurd and just awful, but that's its literary merit. It makes you react in such a way, and that in and of itself is such a win for that author, because you walk away from the book thinking, what the hell did I just read? And every review I've seen of that book, Cows, has either been like 5 stars, this is amazing, or 1 star, this was the most disgusting thing I've ever read. Like, there's no in between for a book like that. And I kind of love books like that. Like, I really respect books that have that sort of intense, like, polarizing reaction. And I especially with film, like, there are a lot of great films that I love that could be labeled as like extreme horror that just are so absurd and so just wonderfully grotesque, but they have this sort of like intense hatred built around them. So like I don't know if you're familiar with any of like Lars von Trier's films, but like Antichrist is a
Yeah.
one from like 2009. Like that film gets a lot of hate. Um, Mother by Darren Aronofsky is another
Yeah.
one. Um, one of my favorites. But I mean, both of those films are incredible. But there's artistry there. Like there's a level
Oh
of
yeah.
artwork on display that you can't deny. Like Antichrist is visually stunning and Mother is visually stunning. You
Yeah.
know, like there's a level of artistry on display that is just totally remarkable.
Yeah, the Antichrist, I can't ever watch it again because it disturbed me so much. But I'm still thinking, I watched it the year it came out, and I still think about it often.
Yeah, it's so impactful, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's I can't watch it again because I found it so upsetting. But I would never say it's a bad film or it's because it did what it was meant to do for to me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a healthy reaction. I think there are like many types of people who interact with extreme horror, and I think obviously it's not so black and white as there are people who get it and people who don't get it. I think there's a lot of gray area. But I think the people that react with like this is disgusting, like 1 star, I think they're totally valid in their assessment. And honestly, a lot of their reviews end up helping sell more books because those reviews help find the right readers and help find the people like us who really want the most like depraved and unsettling kind of fiction. So like that 1 star review, like one sentence where it was like, what the fuck did I just read? Or like this was disgusting, or those reviews are actually I think they're super helpful and I'm glad they exist.
I agree. I follow a YouTuber who's got completely opposite horror taste to me, and I wait for them to do their worst books of the year lists, and then I buy everything
Yeah,
that they hated. So, um,
love it. Love it.
I think if we just go back to At Dark I Become Loathsome, I think that another thing that I loved about it, and maybe this speaks to people who are horror fans and people who just aren't. I think when you're confronted with real human nature, a lot of people are really uncomfortable with it and they just don't want to engage with it at all. And I thought because our character is follows a blog, um so there was that, and then also the story that's told by a potential client.
Yes.
So there's a lot of sort of dark things happening, but these are truths for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And again, I thought it was very humanizing because you didn't paint anyone out like, oh, this is a really depraved and wrong person. It was people struggling with things that they feel are abnormal about them, or they don't even know why they're feeling certain things. And
Yeah, I'm glad you felt that way because like it goes back to what I said before about how I feel like a chronicler of like human depravity and suffering. Like I really feel like it's not my job and it's not my intention to paint any of these characters as like evil, outright like definition of evil. Like a lot of the things in this book are people imagining and like having these like intrusive thoughts about certain things. I won't say what because I think people should discover them on their own like as they read the book. But I think the problem happens eventually is when we put action to these like intrusive thoughts. You know what I mean? Like when we carry out, like when we think about something and then we go through with the depravity of what we were just considering. There's a difference between thought and action, obviously.
yeah, I actually put that in my review that I've written.
Oh, did you? Amazing.
Yeah, that everybody has intrusive thoughts, and
Yeah,
usually you're in control of your actions. But if you go through something really traumatic and you're not quite yourself, and you know trauma responses are trauma responses. Like anyone, this could happen to anyone, is how I felt, is that all of a sudden you can start thinking a certain way or be pushed into a different mode of thinking, or things that were out of the question for you before suddenly start to make sense. And
totally.
these are all responses to things that you're experiencing. I think that that's why a lot of people are uncomfortable with fiction like this, because this isn't like, this stuff doesn't just happen to like bad people and they're born to make bad decisions. This could be you, this could be me, this is, you
Yeah,
know.
I mean, it applies to everybody in a lot of ways. Like, it's very universal, and I think that's what makes people really uncomfortable, and I think that's what makes people write some of this material off in general. They're like, I don't want to engage with that, but I've always been someone who really loves challenging artwork and loves seeing the harsh truths reflected in the art that I consume. So for me, it's almost like fun. It's almost like a pleasure to engage with material like this. But I know that it's definitely not for everybody. But the people that it's for, I hope that I hope that it resonates with them is really all I can say about that, you know.
I think there's I felt the same way when I read Full Immersion by Gemma Moore, and
Oh, I love
that's,
Gemma. Yeah.
yeah, she's great. And that book, for anyone who hasn't read it, is a sort of exploration of postnatal depression and things like that. And I've never gone through that myself, but there was a lot that I related to in that as well. And I think that it brings a sense of kinship to people who are feeling lonely with certain things when they read a book like yours or like that, where it's really relatable. And so that kind of connection isn't just with the work, it's with the author as well sometimes, because you're like, oh, there are people that feel just like me and they're writing books about it, or they, you know, you've experienced enough where you can imagine some of these, you know, follow through a bit further on with some of the things that we've gone through and stuff. This is slight deviation, but I have to ask you about your title and your titles in general, actually. Do you, at what point in the creative process do you come up with your titles?
Usually it's one of the first things I think about. Yeah, I'm kind of superstitious when it comes to writing, and I have like my own sort of like ritual, kind of not like the one in the book, but just my own like writing routine and ritual. And I really can't start writing a book until I at least have a working title, something that I can work toward and then refine. There have been a couple instances where uh, I had a title and my publisher said, let's change it to something else. It was funny. I have a book coming out with Titan in 2027 or 2028, and the original title for it was just a one-word title. And I was like, oh, I'm going to switch it up and I'm going to surprise people. I'm only going to do like a one-word title because I know I'm known for my like long Baroque, like poetic sort of sounding titles. And Titan came back and they were like, we love this title, but we really want you to do one of your like long poetic Baroque titles. So I had to like change the title to kind of suit what they were trying to market the book as. But titles are super important to me, and a lot of the titles that I come up with are really like homages to like the Giallo films of like the 1970s and 80s. I don't know if you're familiar with any of those, but like, you
Yeah.
know, Dario Argento did like a lot of Giallo films, Lamberto Bava, Mario Bava. There's like, they have just these insane titles like Who Saw Her Die, What Have You Done to Solange, All the Colors of the Dark. Just they had these really evocative, strange titles. And that's kind of like where I went to title school, I guess. Like I was really into Giallo films, especially in college and like late high school and like early college. I just watched like a ton of these Giallo films. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's like a subgenre of crime, mystery, thriller slash horror films that were uh, set usually were financed and produced in Italy in like the 70s and 80s. And some of the films are like dubbed in English, and some of them are just like in the original Italian. But they're these like really just remarkable films, these thrillers, crime stories, and they have these really graphic, intense death, gory, like violent sequences with like these horrible murders. So they're really just fun to watch. I think they're great, and they have these really just baroque, poetic sounding titles. Like one of the titles is "Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key." Like that's another title for a giallo film. Like these titles are just absolutely insane, and they're so fun. Like you definitely remember what they are and like
Yeah.
how you felt when you were watching these films. So that's kind of like my approach to titles in general. I just think like what would a giallo be called if it was made in 2025?
I love your titles. I actually I'm sure that there were other books before, but I feel like you're the one that set that trend off of long titles. I had a
I see it a
conversation.
lot now. I see it a lot more and more, like a lot of these long titles, and I mean that's great. I think it's awesome.
I had a conversation with someone about a year ago about this, and they're like, have you noticed all these really cool long titles? You could never do that on a book before. They wouldn't let you. And I was like, I was like, I tell it's Eric LaRocca because I was like, people are reading Eric LaRocca, and those titles are so they are eye catching. Initially, when you just see the amount of words for a start on a book
Yeah.
cover, and you're like, oh, what's that? And yeah, it's yeah, I definitely associate that with you, like your brand of books and writing and everything. Uh,
Yeah, I mean it's important to like as a writer, it's important to kind of develop your own brand and like your own style. And a lot of these publishers, these big publishers really want you to kind of come to the table with these things kind of already locked in, which is so unfair to like the younger creatives who maybe are like marginalized or don't have access to certain things. But if you're able to, and if you're able to like define your art in some sort of marketable way early on in the process, you'll be so much better off, honestly.
I I think I think your work is so unique, and
Thank you.
your writing, I love it. And I always make notes as I'm reading a book that I pretty much review everything I read, but especially if I'm like really responding, my notes for your book were pages and pages.
Oh, that's
And
lovely.
a lot of it, like my little note paragraph started with, "Oh my god," or "Oh, this is horrendous, but it's so good."
Oh my God, I love that.
I'll have to upload them at some point. My notes from just I'm like, what the f? I'll
I
find
love
out
it. You absolutely
next.
should. You should give people like a behind the scenes look.
um, I again not going to give any spoilers for anyone, but the way the sort of final act of this book, I don't know why I didn't see it coming, because you do everything is so beautifully set up, but I guess I was so engrossed as I was reading that I just wasn't thinking about it. And I I was very I had a like, I'm sure you know the bits that
Yeah,
I'm referring
yeah.
to, and I that was oh, again, it's horror, so it's not, a nice revelation, but it was so fun to get to it, because I just didn't know that that's what you were going to do. This is going to make sense to anyone at the moment who's listening to this, but you'll know when you read it.
Yeah.
Um, I yeah, you're sort of I find this in your short fiction as well. I've read a lot of your short stories, and your sort of setup payoff is always amazing, because it's
Thank you.
I find that you set things up really well, but in a way where you're kind of like, look over here. So it's not noticed until I that's how I always feel anyway. I'm like, oh, I could have caught it if I was looking for it, but
Yeah.
I
You know,
wasn't.
you know who really taught me how to do that? And like you really learn writers learn a lot just from reading. That's why it's so important to just read as much as possible. Um, you know who really taught me how to do that well was Roald Dahl. I read a lot of Roald Dahl growing up, and he is so brilliant when it comes to like misdirection and
Yeah.
like looking over here when you should be looking over there. And a lot of his stories ended up as like adaptations on like Alfred Hitchcock Presents or um they did a whole series in England, Tales of the Unexpected in like the 70s and 80s. That was all like based on Roald Dahl. But his work, I mean, you read it and it's just so unnerving how remarkable he is at like setting things up early on that you don't really pay attention to. And then there's that big reveal, that amazing payoff at the end. And it really was like reading his stuff that made me like gave me kind of like that formula to kind of work with. So I definitely, if you haven't read any Roald Dahl, anyone listening, like I highly recommend his like adult short stories because they're exceptional.
Yeah, Roald Dahl is wonderful. I actually always say that Roald Dahl is one of the authors that turned me onto horror as a kid, because no one is going to tell me that
Yeah.
something like the was it the Twits and even the
Yeah.
BFG, no, like but like he writes. I mean, it's horror light for kids, but I
Yeah.
do remember being so engrossed. Like even Matilda, something like Matilda, I was very focused on. You know, that poor kid.
I know. Yeah, he's exceptional. He's a great writer. So,
Still have like my a box set of all of the kids stories. I'm planning to reread those this year, see what I get out of them as an adult. So I'm sure there's stuff I missed that went over my
oh,
head.
you should. Let me know how you get on with them. I'd be interested to hear like your thoughts on them now.
Oh, okay, cool. I will. Who do you like to read now, or do you have favorite books of the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been reading a lot of like translated fiction lately. So like I read that book, The Discomfort of Evening, recently. I recently read a French Canadian book called This Country Will Bring Us No Peace, which was all about like grief and loss and a couple relocating to like the quiet solitude of like the countryside. Um, what else do I love? Who else can I shout out? I love the work of like Paul Tremblay. I love Daniel Kraus,
Yeah.
Adam Neville,
Mhm.
Gretchen Felker Martin, Haley Piper. Love the work of David Demchuk, another amazing queer author from Canada. Um, there's so many to list. Gemma Amor, V. Castro. Like there are so many amazing authors to list. I know I'm like missing like a million right now that I should be listing, but
There are
uh,
a lot.
yeah, there's so many, but it's so wonderful. It's so wonderful to see this kind of explosion of horror. Christopher Golden, I recently read his book, The Nightbirds, which is coming out in 2025. Yeah, Jennifer McMahon, Chuck Wendig, like there are just so many amazing, incredible authors to read. I mean, and there's like if you have a certain taste for something in horror, I feel like there's an author for you specifically.
Yeah. Oh, we have similar reading tastes.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I love another thing that Happy Goat Horror is kind of known for is my complete Adam Neville obsession.
Oh, love it. He's brilliant and he's such a lovely guy. I've emailed him a couple times and he just seems like a very nice person.
Yeah, he's really nice, and I found that with Paul as well, Tremblay. And the funny thing about him is, anytime I talk to anyone, they know Paul and they love him. He's
How
just
can
one of
you
those.
not?
What a nice guy. He's lovely.
He is. He is such a nice guy. He's amazing.
um, I think that's another thing about the horror author space that I love is that I don't think I've talked to anyone who hasn't been lovely. Everyone, for a group of people that are probably stereotyped in some sort of way, where I'm sure that you have these comments occasionally in reviews where someone's like, "Are you okay? What's wrong with you? Why did
Yeah,
you write this?"
I
Uh,
do. Yeah.
and assume the kind of person that you must be to have thought of these things, and then you get together with people or speak to people, and they're just like the loveliest, bubbliest people.
I really think it's because we purge so much of our darkness like on the page. I really do believe that. I know like Clive Barker said something similar to that in an interview once, but he said like he doesn't really have nightmares anymore ever since he like started writing professionally, and it's so true. Like I feel the same way. Like I very seldom have nightmares, knock on wood. I feel like everyone I've met in horror in the community has been just so uplifting and generous with their time and really sweet in general. Like it's a great amount of colleagues that we have, and it's just so wonderful, I feel like.
Yeah, it's a very nice space to be in. I find conventions are a happy place for me.
Yeah, I love a good convention.
I could talk to you all day, Eric, but I just realized we've been going an hour. I'm gonna have to release you from my clutches.
Oh, okay.
But maybe I could convince you to come back on your next book release. Then
Oh,
we
I
can
would love that. I would love
yeah,
that.
or we could talk about anything.
Yeah, I'm here for
Fact.
whenever you need me. I'm here.
Oh, lovely to know. So, okay, so everyone listening, so that's the 28th of January. At Dark I Become Loathsome is due for release. I will put the pre-order links in the description, and also the link for Eric's website as well, so you can have a browse and check out Eric's other work if you're unfamiliar. Oh, I honestly could talk to you all day. Because we only talked about this one book. I had a whole bunch of stuff on other books. I just have to save those for other videos.
For the sequel. Yeah.
So we're yes, gonna thank you again so much for doing this, Eric. This has been wonderful. And is there anything you would like to say before we sign off?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Kaylee. It's been such a pleasure, such a delight to chat with you. And, I just hope people listening, I hope that they're happy and well in 2025. And I hope you all read a lot of great horror.
Yes. Well, that's an excellent way to end this little episode. So our sign off on Happy Goat Horror, because we're goats, is bleat. Bleat, everybody.